Stress is a big part of addiction because it, just like internal and external substance-using cues, people, places, sights, sounds, depression, anxiety, I'm getting ready to give a talk, these sorts of things can be internal cues to facilitate the thoughts about, hey, I wonder how Johnny's doing. Johnny might be my old friend that I used to use drugs with, for example, and can they get that? That's really kind of how the phenomenon of craving starts. It's just by a simple little thought that just kind of festers. Stress is like internal and external cues, another cue, but it uses a different pathway. And in order to understand the role of stress in addiction, well, let's go back and look at pleasure again, because this is where it all starts. Stress, interestingly, produces this chemical called CRF. It's a neurohormone called CRF, and it does this with all people, not just addicts. And there's very, very various roles that this particular neurohormone serves, but one of them is a learning signal, just like pleasure is a learning signal to identify things that are important in the environment. Stress produces this neurohormone called CRF that is supposed to keep dopamine in balance, but also under stress, there's extra CRF that's produced, and it pushes back down on dopamine. It reduces the amount of dopamine in the pleasure circuitry and basically says this is awful. Reduce dopamine in the pleasure circuitry on things that should be enjoyable but aren't. In addiction, what's different though is that these individuals have this neuroadaptation that they know how to produce incredibly large spikes of dopamine that are strong enough to override CRF. And so all they have to do is use sufficient enough of an intoxicating substance and their dopamine levels rise back again, even in spite of this natural phenomenon. That's why oftentimes you'll see people relapse at stressful times. And their brain is different in that way than perhaps yours is. So stress management is an important part of recovery. And stress might be the way I perceive things, so I might want to start changing the way I perceive things. And then I also might want to learn how to take better care of myself. So you might hear a lot of addicts talking about stuff like self-care and all this kind of softy-foofy stuff. Well, there's reasons for that, like taking good care of yourself, learning how to effectively manage stress, learning how to effectively navigate through cognitive processes that make stress worse is part of the recovery from this particular phenomenon. And the reason that that's so effective is that it prevents the buildup of this particular substance in the first place. And when it does start to develop, having capacities for getting out of that situation before it gets so bad that this drive is initiated, this drive, I wonder how Johnny's doing. That's what, it isn't this frothing, I gotta have drugs, that most people imagine. It starts off with it's a cognitive process. It starts off as a very simple, innocent thought. I remember when I was sitting on the beach below, it's this little thought that festers and starts to reduce enough of particularly these neurotransmitters that say, continue with this thought. Seek it out. There's something salient and important in your environment. You should go look for it. But the way human beings go look for it is, I'm going to distort reality enough to make it make sense. Because if it doesn't make sense, I can't feel good about it. And it works better if I make it make sense. So I'm going to do that. Even though, based on one's individual history, extensive negative consequences as a result of this particular behavior, you would think that would seem ludicrous. But remember, neuroadaptation of the parts of my brain that are supposed to be able to measure stuff like that are impaired. And so once this is activated, I'm unable to do that. It's the role of stress. So it's important. If we're going to be treating this as a chronic disorder, treating stress would be, in a long-term way, would be important.